category of Black identity extremists likely motivated to target law enforcement. My understanding now is that there is a new category, racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists. And I'm actually concerned about this as well. And I'm concerned about it because of the FBI's long history of collapsing Black activism in the fight for civil rights, and especially against police abuse, with terrorism. So even in this document, several Black individuals and one organization is included along with well-known white supremacist domestic organizations, domestic terrorist organizations. The FBI says from 2015 through 2019, approximately 846 individuals were arrested for domestic terrorism. And I wanted to know how many of these were African American.
Congresswoman, I appreciate your comments about the changes we made in response to some of the conversations we had early in my tenure on the so-called BIE issue. The particular document you're reading from, I'm not sure sitting here right now that I'm certain which document you're referring to, so maybe the best thing to do there would be for us to have my staff follow up with yours and be sure that I'm answering. Yeah.
Let me ask you several other questions. Do you know of any Black domestic terrorist organizations? Could you tell me their names and what attacks that they have landed? I wanted to know if you consider, or if the movement for Black Lives or Black Lives Matter is considered a racially motivated violent extremist organization.
I appreciate the question, because this is something that I think is important for me to be able to clarify really across the spectrum. So the first point that's really important here is that we don't designate domestic terrorist organizations, period. Unlike on the foreign terrorist enforcement side, where there's a specific statutory scheme for designating terrorist organizations, there is no such scheme for domestic terrorism, whether it's on in the end that you're talking about or any other end. Having said, but can I? Sorry.
Organizations as domestic terrorists.
Sorry.
White, Black, or otherwise.
I couldn't hear you flickered out there.
You don't. You just said you don't designate organizations as domestic terrorist organizations.
That's correct. What we do is investigate individuals with proper predication. In some instances, those individuals will conspire or engage in criminal conduct with each other. And in some cases, we will open a conspiracy investigation or a so-called enterprise investigation.
Do you have investigations of Black individuals or activists that are involved in the movement around police abuse or civil rights in those categories? And the reason why I'm asking that is because there's a number of Black Lives Matter individuals, leaders who have been visited regularly by the FBI in their homes, who have been asked about their plans for various protests, et cetera. Some of those individuals might not be aware that if they misrepresent certain facts to the FBI, that they could in fact be committing a crime. And so I wanted to ask you specifically about your surveillance of these organizations. And it's my understanding that there were a couple of protests where the FBI did surveillance and used surveillance aircraft, actually, with organizations that were protesting in Washington, D.C. and Baltimore.
So we're talking about a few different things here. So the first thing is we do investigate individuals for criminal activity that occur and violence that occurs in the middle of protests, regardless of what the basis of their protest is. And I really can't speak to specific cases because I would need to know the facts, and I would also need to make sure that I wasn't talking about an ongoing investigation. We do not investigate First Amendment groups. We don't investigate people for speech, for association, for assembly, for membership in domestic First Amendment groups. We have had a few cases that I can think of off the top of my head in the last 2 years involving individuals who committed we would consider domestic terror attacks, justifying their attacks, lethal attacks I should add, justifying their attacks based on their interpretation of the so-called Black Hebrew Israelite faith. So that that's probably the best example that I could give you, but that's about the only thing that comes to mind as we're sitting here talking right now.
The gentlelady's time has expired. Mr. Buck?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director Wray, for your service to our country. And I want to personally thank you for the great work of the FBI.